From Orangeburg, South Carolina, this is Democracy Now!
100,000 people who are dying prematurely each year from air pollution. That's more than are dying from gun violence. And unfortunately, it is African American and Latinos who are actually losing their lives.
The first ever Presidential Forum on Environmental Justice is taking place tonight here at South Carolina State University. We'll speak to local leaders and environmental justice advocates. Then we remember the Orangeburg Massacre. It was here, February 8th, 1968, that South Carolina highway patrolmen opened fire on unarmed black student protesters here at South Carolina State University, killing 3 and wounding 28.
It was maybe 6 or 7 seconds. Boom, 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 boom. Students was hollering, yelling, and running. So by this time, I went into a slope right near the campus, where the front end of the campus, and I kneeled down. I got up to run, and I took one step. That's all I could remember. I took that one step, I got hit in the back. When I got hit in the back, this is when I got paralyzed.
We'll hear from survivors of the massacre and speak to the civil rights photographer Cecil Williams, who spent decades trying to raise awareness about this largely ignored moment in American history. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. A senior State Department official, George Kent, told impeachment investigators that President Trump's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, carried out a campaign of lies to smear U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch, before she was abruptly recalled from her post in May. That's according to a full transcript of Kent's closed-door testimony released Thursday. Kent is slated to testify next Wednesday on the first day of televised hearings in the impeachment inquiry into whether President Trump withheld military aid from Ukraine in order to pressure the Ukrainian president to investigate Trump's political rival, Joe Biden, and his son. The New York Times reports Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky was prepared to bow to Trump's demands and was planning to announce the investigations in an interview with CNN on September 13th. But only days before the scheduled interview, the Trump administration released the $400 million in aid after news about the freeze leaked, sparing the Ukrainian president from having to announce the investigation. The United States and China are pledging that an initial trade deal would remove some tariffs in a move that could de-escalate the ongoing trade war between the two countries. The initial trade deal has not yet been finalized. Since taking office, President Trump has levied tariffs on $360 billion worth of Chinese goods. A midnight self-massacre. That was the plan hatched by some senior Trump administration officials who considered resigning en masse last year to sound the alarm about Trump's conduct. They ultimately rejected the idea over concerns it would further destabilize the government. The aborted warning is one of a series of revelations in a forthcoming book titled A Warning. Its author is an anonymous senior official within the Trump administration who published an anonymous op-ed in the New York Times last year headlined, "I am part of the resistance inside the Trump administration." In the book, the author describes senior officials waking up and trying to respond to Trump's overnight Twitter announcements, writing, quote, "It's like showing up at the nursing home at daybreak to find your elderly uncle running pantsless across the courtyard and cursing loudly about the cafeteria food as worried attendants tried to catch him. You're stunned, amused, and embarrassed all at the same time. Only your uncle probably wouldn't do it every single day. His words aren't broadcast to the public, and he doesn't have to lead the U.S. government once he puts his pants on," unquote. The author also claims Trump once asked White House lawyers to write a bill to send to Congress aimed at reducing the number of federal judges after various judges had thwarted Trump's policies. Trump reportedly said, quote, "Can we just get rid of the judges? Let's get rid of the expletive judges. There shouldn't be any at all, really," he said. This according to the forthcoming book, A Warning. The billionaire former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg is reportedly preparing to jump into the 2020 presidential race. The New York Times reports Bloomberg has sent staffers to Alabama to gather signatures in order to qualify him for the primary. His possible 2020 bid comes as he's reportedly skeptical that former Vice President Joe Biden can beat out his progressive challengers, Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren and Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders, in the Democratic primary. Democratic presidential candidate Senator Bernie Sanders unveiled his immigration plan Thursday, promising to abolish ICE, that's Immigration and Customs Enforcement, to push for a path to citizenship, cease deportations, and immediately grant legal status to the nearly 2 million immigrants who are eligible for DACA, that's Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. Sanders said he would accomplish many of these reforms through executive actions. Sanders also vowed to end family separation at the border and allow asylum seekers to remain in the United States while their cases are resolved. He also said he would halt the construction of Trump's border wall, which has already begun construction in the Sonoran Desert in Arizona. Undocumented students across the United States are walking out of school today in solidarity with immigrants who have Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, an Obama-era program that grants work permits and deportation relief to nearly 1 million undocumented people who were brought to the country as children. Next week, the Supreme Court will begin to hear oral arguments in lawsuits demanding the Trump administration preserve DACA, which Trump tried to kill in 2017. Under the banner of Home is Here, dozens of immigrants with DACA have led a 16-day march from New York to Washington, D.C. to pressure the Supreme Court to save the program. The online news outlet Quartz reports the Department of Homeland Security plans to have biometric data on hundreds of millions of people by 2022. In a recent presentation, which was reviewed by Quartz, DHS said it expects to have a database containing the fingerprints as well as the face and iris scans of nearly 260 million people traveling in and out of the United States, raising major privacy concerns over the agency's growing surveillance efforts. In Iraq, security forces are continuing their bloody crackdown against the massive anti-government protests sweeping the country. On Thursday, forces killed 5 protesters in the southern city of Basra. Today, there were reports of another 5 protesters killed in the capital, Baghdad. Protesters have taken to the streets across Iraq for over a month, demanding jobs, better public services, and an end to government corruption. In Bolivia, tensions are rising over last month's presidential election in which the Bolivian president, Evo Morales, was declared the winner of a controversial 4th term. Some members of the opposition have disputed the results, claiming election fraud. On Wednesday, opposition protesters kidnapped a mayor loyal to President Morales, forcibly cut her hair, doused her in red paint, and paraded her through the streets. This is Mayor Patricia Arce.
I am with the truth, and I am not afraid to say my truth. I'm in a free country, and I'm not going to be silenced. If you want me dead, kill me. And now I say, for this movement, for change, I'm going to give my life.
This is Mayor Patricia Arce of the Bolivian town of Vinto. Anti-government demonstrators and anti-government demonstrations also have been growing in the capital, La Paz. This is Marco Pomare.
If our democracy is still trampled over, then we will not leave La Paz without removing from the government palace those who are killing us, those who are assaulting us, those who are persecuting us.
Brazil has sided with the United States for the first time in choosing not to condemn the U.S. embargo against Cuba during the annual United Nations resolution vote Thursday. The UN General Assembly still voted overwhelmingly to condemn the U.S. embargo, with 187 out of 193 countries voting against the United States. This is Cuban Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez.
The
blockade has caused incalculable humanitarian damages. It is a flagrant, massive, and systematic violation of human rights. It qualifies as an act of genocide under Articles 2B and C of the Convention of the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, adopted in 1948. There is not one single family that has not suffered the consequences of this.
In Brazil, former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva could be freed from prison following a Brazilian Supreme Court ruling to end the mandatory imprisonment of people convicted of a crime who have lost their first appeal. The ruling restores a previous policy that allows people convicted of a crime to exhaust all of their appeal options before being sent to prison. In addition to Lula, the Supreme Court's decision could help free some 5,000 prisoners who are still appealing their convictions. Meanwhile, a far-right Brazilian journalist tried to punch Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, co-founder of The Intercept, Glenn Greenwald, after a heated argument during the live taping of a radio show. The far-right journalist, Augusto Nunes, had previously made insulting comments about Greenwald's family. In Hong Kong, a student has died from injuries sustained after he fell during a clash between student protesters and police earlier this week. The death of Cho Tzu-lok has sparked widespread anger among student protesters, whose demonstrations have rocked Hong Kong. This is Hong Kong activist Joshua Wong.
We mourn together, and we urge Hong Kong people wear black T-shirt together today and tomorrow to show our solidarity and unity. And now is the time for the government to set up the independent investigation on the clash. We need to know and seek for truth and justice, and which is really insane and unreasonable for how the government allowed the police attempt to murder Hong Kong people, which proved that reform the police force is a must.
And in New York City, longtime immigration activist Marco Saavedra attended his final asylum hearing on Thursday, in which he argued his life would be at risk if he were sent to Mexico. The immigration judge overseeing Saavedra's case will have a final decision by January 17th, 2020. Saavedra has been living in the United States since he was 3 years old. He's been involved in several high-profile immigration actions. In 2012, he purposely got himself arrested by federal authorities in order to infiltrate the GEO Group's for-profit immigration jail in Florida, the Broward Transitional Center, and investigate allegations of human rights abuses inside the secretive facility. In 2013, Marco Saavedra self-deported to Mexico with 8 other Dreamers to protest the separation of immigrant families under the Obama administration. To see our full interview with Marco Saavedra before his final asylum hearing this week, go to democracynow.org. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting from South Carolina State University here in Orangeburg, where tonight, on this very stage, the first ever Presidential Forum on Environmental Justice will be held. I'll be co-moderating with former EPA official Mustafa Ali. All Democratic and Republican candidates were invited. Those that accepted and are coming to this forum are Senators Elizabeth Warren and Cory Booker, Tom Steyer, Marianne Williamson, John Delaney, and Joe Sestak. The forum will be hosted by the National Black Caucus of state legislators and leaders from frontline communities. South Carolina is a crucial state for the 2020 presidential race and one of the first that will have a Democratic primary following the New Hampshire primary and the caucuses in Iowa and Nevada. It'll be the first measure of Democratic candidates' strengths with black voters. In 2007, a Democratic presidential primary debate also took place right here on this stage. South Carolina is a state where African-American communities and people of color are on the front lines of fighting for justice in the face of extreme environmental racism for years. South Carolina has repeatedly been pummeled by climate-fueled hurricanes, including Florence, which swept through the South in 2018, causing epic floods. Its black residents have faced disproportionate air and water pollution, exposure to environmental hazards. But South Carolina is also home to some of the most successful responses to environmental racism. The town of Spartanburg was once known as the Devil's Triangle for its 2 abandoned industrial sites and a 30-acre dump. But it's now being hailed as a model for environmental justice after the community worked with the Environmental Protection Agency to invest in health centers and revitalize formerly devastated neighborhoods. Well, we're joined right here in Orangeburg, South Carolina, by Mustafa Ali, who I'll be moderating the forum with tonight. He's the former head of the Environmental Justice Program at the Environmental Protection Agency. He's a former leader in the Hip Hop Caucus and is now the vice president of the National Wildlife Federation. Welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to be with you here in Orangeburg.
Thank you, Amy, for having me.
So talk about why you've chosen this site. Later in the broadcast, we're going to talk about this moment in history 51 years ago. When state troopers opened fire on students, before Kent State, before Jackson State. But right now, we're talking about this moment in history in 2020, when there are a record number of candidates running for president. Why have you chosen this forum in South Carolina, and why the first presidential forum on environmental justice? What does that mean, environmental justice?
Yeah. Well, it was important, one, to have it at a HBCU or minority serving institution to make sure that folks understood that the students who go to school here care about what's happening. They are voters, along with all of the community residents. Also here in South Carolina, it's ground zero. It's ground zero for the pollution that folks are dealing with housing issues, transportation issues, and also the impacts from climate change. The floods that have happened, have played a devastating role in people's lives and farmers' lives. All these different folks are coming together. But also, as you sort of shared with folks, there are also these incredible leaders who are also helping to make real change happen. So we have the environmental injustices that are happening that folks are focusing on, but we also have the change that's happening, how people are revitalizing communities. Reverend Leo Woodbury, Harold Mitchell, Omar Muhammad, so many incredible leaders who are right here, right now, making change happen.
So this issue of environmental justice, CNN held a public town hall with the candidates on climate change. What is the difference?
Well, environmental justice is dealing with these disproportionate impacts that are happening inside of communities. So it's important that we have these conversations about climate change, but those are the symptoms of a disease. And the disease has been the racism, the structural inequality that continues to happen inside of communities of color. So disproportionately, those fossil fuel facilities are located in communities of color, lower income communities, and on indigenous lands. And people have for decades been dealing with the public health impacts, but also now those emissions are also a driver in warming up our oceans and warming up the planet. We also know that the transportation routes that have been used to extract wealth from certain communities and bring wealth into other communities and also drop pollution off plays a big role also in what's going on with climate change. And then the last thing is we got 2.2 million miles of pipeline. Most of that pipeline runs through indigenous land, low-income white land, runs through farmers' land, and it ends up on the Gulf Coast in communities of color. All of these play a role in what's going on with climate change, but there's so much more in the environmental justice paradigm.
So, Mustafa, talk about the connection between environmental justice and health, the health impacts.
Well, we have 100,000 people in our country who are dying prematurely from air pollution. That's more than dying from gun violence. Gun violence is extremely important for us to focus on. But when we've got this many people who are dying, then we need to be paying attention to the decisions that folks in Washington and in state houses are making. We've got 1.1 million kids in our country who have been lead poisoned. And primarily those are African-American and Latinx communities and lower-income white communities who are the ones who are being impacted. We got 25 million people who have asthma. We've got 7 million kids, and disproportionately is African-American and Latino children who are the ones who are going to the emergency rooms and the ones who are losing their lives. So these health impacts that are going on actually extract wealth from communities who can least afford to have that wealth extracted, because in many times they are underinsured or uninsured, and folks will have to carry that cost.
And what is your assessment of the presidential candidates' addressing this issue with their plans?
Well, it's great to see that folks have finally, after 40 years, have begun to actually have environmental justice platforms, climate justice platforms. And it's great to see that some of the candidates are actually visiting these communities, frontline communities, sitting down with leaders. But there's so much more that needs to happen, because a part of this forum is about accountability. Folks want to hear, what's your vision? What are the actions you're going to do? How are you going to build an administration that has expertise from frontline communities, indigenous leaders also in that? So it's great to see people saying the words. We need action behind the words.
And I mean, we're talking about both the Democrats and the Republicans. What's happened under the Trump administration?
Well, under the Trump administration, it has been deadly for many of our communities, because they have rolled back over 85 regulations that in many instances just had the bare minimum of protections inside of our most vulnerable communities. Everything from pulling out of the Clean Power Plan and replacing it with the ACE rule, the car rule, the Clean Car Rule, which we know, again, those transportation routes having so much more pollution go off in those communities. You know, removing yourself from the Paris Climate Accord makes no sense, and it's going to have huge impacts in our most vulnerable communities and communities across our country in general. So, you know, we need to have leadership who is actually focused on helping to protect people's lives and living up to when you take that oath.
We're going to go to break and come back, and we'll be joined by several of the people who are participating in tonight's forum. Again, we're here at South Carolina State University. It's a historically black college, one of the HBCUs, college and universities. It is the site of the Orangeburg Massacre 51 years ago. And it is going to be the site tonight on this very stage of a Presidential Forum on Environmental Justice, the very first. We are joined by Mustafa Ali, who was formerly with the Hip Hop Caucus, before that for years with the Environmental Protection Agency. Now he's vice president of the National Wildlife Federation, and he'll be co-moderating the forum tonight with me. Yes, Democracy Now! Is here, and we'll be live streaming this forum tonight at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time around the world. Many stations, radio and television stations, will also be broadcasting this forum. So we hope you do tune in at democracynow.org or on your local station. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back in a minute.
Mother of us all, place of our birth, how can we stand aside and watch the rape of the world? It's the beginning of the end. It's the most heinous of crimes. It's the deadliest of sins. The greatest violation. Us all, place of our birth, we all are witness to the rape of the
World by Tracy Chapman. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting from South Carolina State University here in Orangeburg, where tonight on this very stage, the first ever Presidential Forum on Environmental Justice will be held. Democracy Now! Will be broadcasting and live streaming beginning at 6 p.m. Eastern. I'll be co-moderating with former EPA official Mustafa Ali, who is still with us, former EPA official, formerly with the Hip Hop Caucus, now vice president of the National Wildlife Fund. And we're joined by South Carolina State Representative Gilda Cobb-Hunter, who represents the city of Orangeburg in South Carolina. She's also president of the National Black Caucus of State Legislators. And Melanie Campbell joins us, president of the National Coalition on Black Civic Participation and the convener of the Black Women's Roundtable. We welcome you all to Democracy Now! Representative Cobb-Hunter, you are a first. You are the first woman to represent Orangeburg in the South Carolina State Legislature, and you are representing Black state legislators around the country. Talk about why environmental justice is important to you and why you are hosting tonight's event, tonight's first ever forum.
Well, thanks, Amy, for having us, and we really appreciate the support of Democracy Now! It's important to NBCSL for a variety of reasons. We have total dysfunction in the opinion of state legislators at the federal level, and so when we talk about the issue of environmental justice, climate change, all politics is local, and when we can't get action on the federal level, that leaves us as state legislators to make sure that whatever remedies, whatever mitigation is there, that we are in a position to try to get that done. NBCSL, along with the Hispanic Caucus, and we will be joined tonight by the president of the National Hispanic Caucus, what we recognize is that the issue of environmental justice impacts Black and brown communities. And so we represent these communities. We think it's important for us not to wait on Congress, not to wait on a president, but for us to use the power we have as state legislators and take action. And I would just echo Mustafa's point. We are very pleased that 6 of these candidates who want to be president thought this issue was important enough to not just talk the talk, but to walk the walk. And we welcome them to South Carolina's only state-supported historic Black college and university at South Carolina State. Welcome to Bulldog Country.
And Gilda Cobb-Hunter, how does it work in a state legislature around issues of environmental justice? I mean, we know about ALEC, the right-wing organization that writes legislation, particularly in state legislatures, for state legislatures, and one by one following a trend in the country to cut back on regulations. How do you deal as the head of the NBCSL, the National Caucus of Black Legislators, in responding?
Well, a part of it is what we'll do here tonight. My role as president, in my view, is increasing members' awareness of issues that impact our constituents. We all know the routine issues that all of us care about and all of us are working on. But when it comes to an issue like environmental justice, the awareness of Black legislators, in our view, is not what it should be. And so a part of our goal and a part of what we think is important is increasing our awareness. ALEC has a very strong footprint here in the South Carolina legislature. They spend money. We have members who are in the national leadership of that organization.
This is the American Legislative Exchange Council, presenting model legislation.
And in some cases, in some states in our group, we've had people who didn't even remove the name ALEC, just kind of came in, dropped it. And so we've got to be vigilant, and we've got to stay focused on this issue. And so a part of what I see us needing to do, and that's why this forum is so important, because I'm told from the frontline communities that there has never been this kind of event, which makes it even more appropriate that it's here at South Carolina State. We've got to just, the way you deal with ALEC, I believe the best way to eat an elephant, pun intended, is one small bite at a time.
And Mustafa Ali, how do you see ALEC playing out in legislatures around the country?
Well, they have a particular view that they're trying to push, and that's why it's so important for us to really educate folks and engage them in the civic process and in the legislative process so that they understand that they have power and that they can help to frame out fields. So environmental justice organizations, public health organizations, civil rights organizations, all coming together to deal with these impacts that are happening inside of our communities can balance out those who might not necessarily have the best intention for our communities.
Melanie Campbell, you represent the largest voting bloc within the Black community, and that's African American women. Talk about your organization, both the Round Table as well as the National Coalition on Black Civic Participation, and what you're trying to accomplish.
Well, first of all, thank you, Amy, and thank my colleagues here. And it's good to be back on this campus. I was on this campus in 2008 on a rainy day in February, working on getting out the vote with our Black You Vote program. And so it's always good to be back here in Orangeburg, in South Carolina. I hadn't been in Orangeburg in a little while. So thank you all for the invitation to work with you all on this project. Well, the National Coalition has been around for almost 44 years. It's a coalition of national organizations, not just African American, but labor and other kinds of civil rights and social justice organizations. Black Women's Roundtable is our women and girls power building arm, and it's really like the glue for the organization. And I say that because when you talk about the black vote, black women, we're the secret sauce to move the black vote. And that's because of our voting strength and the fact that we influence our families and all of our significant others. So when you say there's a big surge in the black vote, that's because black women didn't just show up, because we're going to show up, but we're going to also encourage our families and our communities to do that. We also are many times leading a lot of the work and becoming more unapologetic about demanding respect for that, whether it's the Democratic Party or progressive community, to understand that we're not just a voting bloc, we also are leaders in this space. This issue around, so I appreciate Mustafa and I was going to say Congresswoman.
No, please, don't start that.
Don't start no mess,
please.
Right?
Please,
my sister, friend Hilda, for what they're doing here. This issue we see when it comes to environmental justice is critical when you talk about issues impacting health, in issues impacting economic justice, because the impact it has on our communities. And so our young people, who just a little bit younger than us, right, who demand that this be a critical issue in this election.
Why is environmental justice so critical, especially for
I grew up in Florida. I grew up along the coast of the Atlantic, big city called Mims, Florida. And so growing up around, we had hurricanes growing up. You know, you didn't have to leave home. Mm-hmm. My mother passed away 3 years ago, and we would always have to worry. Now they have to, most of the time, they have to leave. I have a brother that's still there who most of the time he has to get on a plane and fly up there in Virginia and get away. You can't stay anymore because there's so much. It's very different from what had happened 30 years ago, 40 years ago. What's happening now is real impact in our communities. I can remember growing up where orange groves were beautiful. Everybody had orange groves. It was a part of the economy. That was if you didn't have a job, you can go pick oranges and make a living. Right? You can't do that. Those things have been destroyed by the climate change and other kinds of things. Damu Smith, I'm a channel, was one of my best buddies, right, who really educated me down in Cancer Alley, Louisiana.
It's in fact where I met him at one of the first conferences.
He took us on the bus.
Cancer Alley, Baton Rouge.
Back in the day. So I've been around this for a while. Connie Tucker, who's another sister. I lived in Atlanta for 20 years. My current sister who keeps me on this is Felicia Davis with HBCU Green Fund. Understanding this issue is not a side issue. It's very much intricately a part of what's dealing with even the issues around wealth building and how that impacts our community.
And do you feel like the candidates are addressing these issues? How do you get them to focus?
I will say that our Black You Vote young people are having these debate watch parties, and they've been doing these polls, and they look for who they won, which I won't get into that. But they also say, what are they not hearing? And environmental justice and climate change are key. They're not the number one, but they're high, like the number 3 or something like that. Consistently, every month they host these things, and that's what they're selling us. And so young people are saying, demanding that. So the candidates that don't get that are going to miss getting that Generation Z vote and that millennial vote this year.
Representative Gilda Cobb-Hunter, Regenesis, explain what that project is, because South Carolina is not only ground zero for the problems, but also for solutions.
Right, and before I talk about Regenesis, if I could, Amy, just pick up on the point that Melanie made about the young people and which candidates are speaking to the vote, to this issue. That's a part of why NBCSL is here sponsoring this event, because we can't afford to wait for the DNC or the RNC to bless this and say, okay, we're going to have a debate. This issue impacts our communities. We thought it important to step up and say, you know what? DNC, RNC, y'all don't want to talk about climate change? Guess what? We don't need your permission to talk about climate change. We've got a vehicle that we can use to talk about this issue. And it is important that these Democratic candidates understand how this issue resonates with young voters, with progressive voters, with seasoned voters. This is an issue whose time has come and it's not going away. The one candidate that consistently spoke to the issue is no longer in the race, and that's Governor Jay Inslee. All of them do the photo ops. All of them talk the talk. They all have the talking points, but whether or not there's specificity in how they can get it done, which is what Regenesis is doing here in South Carolina, has done. We've got a lot of people who are academic who talk about environmental justice, but we have in Spartanburg, South Carolina, under the leadership of my former colleague, Harold Mitchell, a project called Regenesis that has reclaimed and revitalized that entire community. And he's done that in spite of.
So he got $20,000 EPA environmental justice grant to help clean up these contaminated sites.
Yes. Leveraged $20,000 into several million, has a community that is now, that once was a wasteland, that once was the home of a fertilizer plant. He is working.
This was called Devil's Triangle because it was so polluted.
Exactly. And again, what is important to understand is what we need to be lifting up are people who are on the ground working. Not people theorizing about it, not people who are just, well, I'll just say Regenesis as a project that is the role model. And to pass on just a tidbit, I don't think a lot of people know, because heroes are very rarely recognized in their own hometown. Regenesis and its founder, Harold Mitchell, has gone to Taiwan. He is known internationally as, again, somebody who doesn't just talk about it, but who actually does something. And that's the point of the platform that will be the point of your questions and Mustafa's questions tonight to these candidates who are showing up. What are you going to do specifically?
And finally, Mustafa Ali, I mean, you have South Carolina. It's you've got the primaries and caucuses first in New Hampshire and in Iowa. These are two of the whitest states.
Yes.
And then you have the large African-American community in South Carolina. Why this is so significant. I mean, so much attention is paid to the whitest states in this country simply because they're first in the primary system. It means all the candidates are gearing their plans to those states.
Well, you can't take our vote for granted.
Right.
If you want our vote, you better show up. So it sends a signal to folks. People want to see you and touch you and hear firsthand what you have to share. So if you are willing to spend time in New Hampshire and in Iowa sitting down with folks, I appreciate that. You need to be in the South. You know that there are folks who are going to vote, and you need to actually solidify that vote by sharing with them the realness of what your vision is. What is your policies? Talk to them about their kitchen table issues and how it's going to be addressed. So if you are not sitting down with Mrs. Ramirez in her kitchen or Mr. Johnson on his back porch, having some conversations as well, then people may not think you're as serious as you say you are.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to thank you all for being with us. This is only the beginning as we tonight hold this forum. Mustafa Ali, former head of the Environmental Justice Program at the Environmental Protection Agency, former leader of the Hip Hop Caucus, now vice president of National Wildlife Federation, Gilda Cobb-Hunter, president of National Black Caucus of State Legislators, and Melanie Campbell, president of the National Coalition on Black Civic Participation, also convener of the Black Women's Roundtable. Mustafa Ali and I will be co-moderating the first ever presidential forum on environmental justice here at South Carolina State University in Orangeburg tonight. If you have questions for the candidates, please write to us at Democracy Now's Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. We'd love to hear from you. Again, we'll be live streaming and broadcasting on stations around the country starting at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Our website's democracynow.org. When we come back, the Orangeburg Massacre. It was February 8, 1968. That South Carolina Highway Patrol officers opened fire on black students here at South Carolina State University who were protesting a segregated bowling alley. The patrolmen killed 3 and wounded 28. We'll hear more. Stay with us.
Back on campus and things were heating up real quick. Passing cars could see the bonfire, see him smashing bottles and throwing bricks. The National Guard and the Highway Patrol are in position up on the hill. Fire's red glare, shots bursting in the air, screaming, how many can we kill? Have you heard about Orangeburg? What happened there 40 years ago? No, you can't come in without white skin. They say they just want to go bowling. Now the shotguns are exploding down in Orangeburg.
Orangeburg by Soul Driven Train. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting from the Martin Luther King Auditorium on the South Carolina State University campus here in Orangeburg. The university is the site of the 1968 Orangeburg Massacre, one of the most violent, least remembered events of the civil rights movement. The plaque just outside this building tells the story. It was February 8, 1968. A crowd of students gathered on the campus of South Carolina State to protest segregation at Orangeburg's only bowling alley. After days of escalating tension, students started a bonfire and held a vigil on the campus to protest. Dozens of police arrived on the scene. The state troopers fired live ammunition into the crowd. When the shooting stopped, 3 students were dead, 28 wounded. The 3 killed were 19-year-old South Carolina State students Henry Smith and Samuel Hammond, and 17-year-old high school student Delano Middleton, who came to South Carolina State every day after school to see his mom and get a bite to eat. Although the tragedy predated the Kent State shootings and Jackson State killings, it was the first of its kind on any American college campus, received little national media attention. Here are some of the survivors of the Orangeburg Massacre remembering that fateful day. This is an excerpt of an oral history project conducted by Jack Bass, who was a reporter at the time. This clip begins with survivor Robert Lee Davis.
It was a barrage of shots, and like I say, it was maybe 6 or 7 seconds. Boom, 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 boom. The students was hollering, yelling, and running. So by this time, I went into a slope right near the campus, where the front end of the campus, and I kneeled down. I got up to run, and I took one step. That's all I could remember. I took that one step. I got hit in the back. When I got hit in the back, this is when I got paralyzed. Students was tramping over me because they was afraid.
And I dropped to the ground immediately, instinctively. I dropped to the ground. And within 2 or 3 seconds, I began to hear rounds going past my ears. I felt my coat like it was somebody was trying to pull it off, with what it really was rounds hitting my coat. And then I got hit. Prior to being hit, I heard some people started yelling. In fact, I remember hearing somebody laugh just before we realized we were being shot at. We thought they were shooting in the air. It entered right here and just missed my spine. I didn't see much bleeding. I remember running, getting up and moving. I think the coat that I had on probably formed as a compressed maybe. I don't know. I had a large overcoat on. I remember asking him, I said, Joe, can you see? Am I just nicked? I was hoping that I just got grazed, And he said, no, look like, there's a hole there, Jordan. I said, oh, golly. And we got onto the infirmary, and there was blood all over the place. I mean, people were lying around, yelling and screaming, and the poor nurse on duty, she was a mess. She had never seen anything like that. It was worse than any combat situation. Let's put it this way, it was probably equivalent to a combat situation in war. The official count was 27 plus 3, actually 30. 30. 3 died, 27 injured.
I remember getting shot in my face and being spun around, and the instinct said, you got to get out of here, you got to go for safety. And the only thing I could think of was to get into the infirmary.
Just so happened, there was a trash can in front of me. I was on a pretty good coverage there of that trash can, but the trash can had some legs under it. And that's how I got shot in the hip. The bullet come under the leg. Under the trash can, it caught me in the hip. And under the trash can, it caught me in the leg. If it wasn't for the trash can, I probably would have been dead. If I would have stood up, I would have been dead. But I had enough courage to stay there for at least 45 seconds after the shooting. And folks would run all across me, crying and shooting. Some of them was crawling. And I realized they just ceased fire. That's when I got up and ran to the infirmary. When I got to the infirmary, my best friend Sam, which is dead now, the one that they killed, he was laying in the middle of the floor, just trying to grasp for air. And at that particular point, I didn't even know I was shot. See, I crossed my leg in the infirmary, and I saw a little red spot on my pants. And I realized right then that I've been hit down there. And by sitting down, watching Sam eat emotion myself, when I stood up, reached back there, I had a big apple back there. I didn't realize I got shot in the hip neither, see. Got shot in the hip. The whole muscle was just like big as a big fist. And I realized I got shot in the hip, got shot twice.
He took me to the school infirmary, and from there I laid on the floor on a mattress. At this time, Sam Hammond, we was laying head to head by each other. And the last thing I can remember Sam said, they used to call me Big Dooley because I was playing football at this time. I was weighing about 260. And this is when Sam asked me, he said, Dooley, you think I'm going to live? I say, Sam, you're going to be all right, buddy. And next time I look over there, he was dead. I took my hand and put over his face like this to close his eyes because he died with his eyes open.
Davis and other survivors of the Orangeburg massacre in South Carolina The 9 officers who opened fire that day were all acquitted. The only person convicted of wrongdoing was Cleveland Sellers, a member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, known as SNCC. Sellers was one of the organizers of the protests, convicted of a riot charge, spent 7 months behind bars. He was pardoned in 1993. He would later go on to be president of a South Carolina college. On the 40th anniversary of the Orangeburg Massacre, Democracy Now! Spoke with Cleve Sellers. He described what happened.
It was just a clear case of the police opening fire without any provocation. There was no exchange of gunfire. The students were unarmed, and what precipitated it was the fact that the students on that Monday night went down to the bowling alley to try to bowl. And on Tuesday night, when they went down, they were arrested. And at that point, the state had kind of in mind a kind of Watts riot. And so they began to gear up, and on the night of February the 8th, it probably was 300 law enforcement officers in Orangeburg, and that included the FBI and Army intelligence and the National Guards, the local and state police. So it was kind of an armed camp there. There were so many police that they could actually have walked on the campus and arrested every student on the campus. One officer could have gone over and arrested all the students who were on the campus.
We're joined now by a photographer determined to make sure the Orangeburg Massacre remains part of our national consciousness. Cecil Williams began documenting the civil rights movement in South Carolina in the 50s, photographed the scene and the aftermath of the Orangeburg Massacre. He's also founder of the Cecil Williams Civil Rights Museum here in Orangeburg. We went there last night in the middle of a rainstorm. It's just opened. It's astounding. It shows the photographs of that fateful day, February 8th, and the events leading up to it and the aftermath. It's great to have you with us, Cecil Williams.
It's good to be here today with you as well.
The significance of this massacre in not only Orangeburg history, but I could only think if this had gotten more attention back in 1968, perhaps Jackson State and Kent State wouldn't have happened.
No, this was really a situation in Orangeburg that should not have happened. It was 1968, years after Congress and President Johnson passed the Civil Rights Acts. But in Orangeburg, there was this pocket of resistance, a segregated bowling alley, that upon any citizen walking along Russell Street in Orangeburg encountered this on an everyday basis. But it was the students of State and Claflin and others that got involved. They wanted to change that. This was something that should not have been allowed to exist at the time. But it was a reality, and unfortunately, the deaths and the wounding of so many students was a tragedy that we should never forget.
I wanted to go to a clip from the documentary Scarred Justice, the Orangeburg Massacre in 1968. This clip features Roy Wilkins, who was head of the NAACP at the time.
You know, the first news story we read in New York said there was an exchange of gunfire. And after this, the police shot. Now, there was no exchange of gunfire. There were no guns discovered on the campus among the students. I call you to a hard task, harder than theirs. Theirs is difficult, but they don't have any dead to carry home, and we do. A lot of dead. From way back yonder. Count them over in your mind. These 3 here on this campus, 43 dead in Detroit last year, 23 dead in Newark. Medgar Evers, run on back through history, through Reconstruction, through the Civil War. Think of all the dead we have buried. And so our task is bound to be heavier and more difficult.
That was NAACP head at the time, Roy Wilkins. And now another clip from the documentary Scarred Justice, the Orangeburg Massacre of 1968, featuring Bakari Sellers. Yes, he's a CNN commentator right now. He was the youngest state legislator ever elected, and he was the son of Cleve Sellers. This was Bakari Sellers commemorating the 40th anniversary of the massacre. He was right here in the MLK Auditorium at South Carolina State.
We join here today in our own memorial to remember 3 dead and 27 injured in yet another massacre that marked yet another people's struggle against oppression. These men who died here were not martyrs to a dream, but soldiers to a cause. We find our state and individuals within our state showing no shame in making concentrated efforts to keep this day that we come every year to remember off the historian's tongue and purged from our history books. A group of students built bonfires and sang protest songs. And within moments along the embankments on the front of the campus, police positioned themselves along Highway 601. The state police then closed in on students with shotguns loaded with deadly double-aught buckshots. And for 8 seconds, 1001, 1002.
That was Bakari Sellers, son of Cleveland Sellers, remembering the massacre 40 years later. It's now 51 years. Cecil Williams, you were a photographer at the time. You photographed also. You did all the high school photos of kids for the yearbook. Talk about the 3 boys who died.
All of them were acquaintances of mine. I photographed Milton at Wilkinson High School. But at South Carolina State, on a daily basis, you could see both of them involved in activities like practicing for football, which they engaged in, or in the student center eating a bologna sandwich, or they were very friendly students. And
Henry
they were so
Smith
close.
And Samuel Hammond, 19. They were students here.
They were students here, and I photographed them for the yearbook.
And Delano Middleton was a high school student who came to see his mother all the time at the university?
Yes, I understand. He was just visiting the campus that night, as he did sometimes, waiting on his mother to get off of work, and became involved in this. However, I think that even if he had not been accidentally there, many of the high school students and others in the city also participated. This was not just state and Claflin students, but others involved in really trying to change things. Here was a segregated bowling alley, something that if citizens wanted to bowl, they would have to go 50 miles or 100 miles round trip to Columbia to bowl.
You know, you really were critical in the case. Talk about the shell casings you found. You weren't here that night of the bonfire, but the next morning you came in. Were there police tape around investigating a crime scene of what happened? Of course, the police, it was the state troopers who killed the students, but...
Yes, after the incident was over the next morning very early, and by the way, I narrowly missed being on the site. The only reason I was really not on the site because I photographed everything that the students did as the yearbook photographer. But the next morning about 7 o'clock, I appeared on the campus, and I saw all kinds of things on the ground, and I started picking them up, and some of them were the shells from the shotguns that the highway patrolman had used. Those shells were later used in the investigation to identify which highway patrolman shot them. In the trial, which took place in Florence, I was called in to testify, and understanding in about 30 minutes, they found them innocent. Tragedy. It was shocking, and even today, there's been no really assistance to the students who were wounded, nothing to even bury the students. So it's really even a tragedy that it affects us today. And you have the shell casings in the Cecil Williams Museum. Yes, the museum is something I started because I felt that there was a need to not only preserve South Carolina history, but so much of our history here in this state. We were at the forefront, beginning of this. We're going to do part 2 of the discussion, talk more about the history, but I want to thank you so much for being here. Cecil Williams, photographer, author, best known for his photography documenting the civil rights movement in South Carolina, beginning in the 50s, founders of the Cecil Williams Civil Rights Museum here in Orangeburg. A very special thanks to SCSU President James Clark, Roland Haynes Jr., who runs this auditorium, Ken Davis, Curtis Bradley, and all the other Bulldog staffers who made the broadcast from the MLK Auditorium possible.
possible. Special thanks here to our team, to John Hamilton, Dennis Moynihan, Carla Wills, and Libby Rainey. I am Amy Goodman. We'll be broadcasting tonight from 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Check it out at democracynow.org, the first ever forum on environmental justice. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.